Chapter 3 Irish Mascot 31, New Jersey, USA. Coming out of the Hamilton train station in New Jersey, the New York Times intelligence chief Adam Coleman was carrying an old leather bond bag in his hand. The green-eyed man adjusted his rimless glasses with his finger and looked around. He had found the bag in the safe that Duke had opened with the key he had given him. The only bag in the safe was this bag. Coleman, who took the bag, wasted no time and headed towards the parking lot that was built in a quadrant shape in front of the train station. However, he had not yet looked inside the black bag. Coleman, who found a spot in the last lane of the parking lot that was arranged in 6 arcs, got into his car and immediately set off. Smiling at the 4-leaf clover-shaped vehicle scent that he had attached to his mirror and called the Irish mascot to those who asked, the man checked his mirrors along the way to see if he was being followed. Since Duke and Joanna had gone to Italy, both First Men and himself had begun to think that they were being constantly watched. The Hamilton train station was a popular stop for white-collar workers in New York and New Jersey. He learned from a locksmith that the key opened the safe, and from Martin Blake's credit card charges where the safe was. Making good use of the light afternoon traffic, Coleman reached home in an hour. Entering the parking garage belonging to his apartment, Coleman drove down to the lower floor. The gray concrete walls were lined with numbers indicating the parking spaces of the apartments, and Coleman parked his Ford Fiesta in his usual spot. He wasn't sure if he was being followed. There weren't many cars in the parking lot. He got out of his car and took his bag from the back seat. When the black-windowed minivan parked 3 cars down from his own car suddenly started, he turned towards the vehicle with a start and suddenly collapsed to the ground with lightning in his eyes as the pain in the back of his head shocked him. A large man was standing right behind him. The man, wearing a black suit, black shirt and black tie, had shaved his hair completely. The large man, wearing black leather gloves, hit Coleman's head on the ground with a baseball bat again with all his might. Blood and pieces of flesh sprayed onto his face with a wet explosion. Another man behind him said with disgust, "Did you have to do this?" He was wearing an expensive suit just like the large man with the bat. His brown hair was cut short and gelled. He had a headphone in his left ear, the cord of which went down to the back of his neck. The big man took a handkerchief from inside his jacket, wiped his face, and muttered, "I wanted to make sure you were dead," in a baritone and guttural voice that reminded me of a grizzly bear. The brunette looked at the ground in disgust and protested, "The guy's head exploded." The other looked at his work critically and said, "This kind of thing happens in robberies," and handed the bloody bat to the other. Then he bent down and took Adam Coleman's wallet, phone, and watch from his still trembling body. Finally, he took the bag he found in Coleman's safe and went to the van. There was a homeless man of African descent lying unconscious in the back of the van. They had taken the addict known as Donnie Gold into the van about 10 hours ago and had been giving him drugs continuously. Donnie would die of a heroin overdose 2 blocks later, and a baseball bat and Adam Coleman's other belongings would be found next to him. July 31st, Athens, Greece. Tracker. After getting Eleni, Duke and Joanna settled into their hotel rooms, she got in her car and drove straight to the airport. Just a few kilometers from the airport, she called Luca Angelus, the head of security she had spoken to this morning, on her mobile phone. When the phone finally answered after a long ringing, a cheerful male voice said, "This is a holy sign." "Luca, I'm coming there." "Let's meet at the main gate," Eleni said, laughing in a cheerful voice like a waterfall. "Where are you?" Luca asked, laughing too. "At the security gate," Eleni said, glancing briefly at where she had passed. Luca hurriedly said, "Fine, I'll come and pick you up, you can tell your problem there," and hung up the phone. Finding Eleni at the main gate 10 minutes later, Luca looked quite excited. "I saw you twice a day. To what do I owe this pleasure?" he asked, smiling. Laughing at Luca, Eleni said, "Twice? Why not?" "Luca, I think I've fallen for you," and got right to the point. She didn't like talking on the phone while driving, and she didn't want to treat Luca the way she treated the other people she used her brandies for. Luca smiled, crossing his arms over his chest, and said with a flirtatious smile, "This could cost you." Eleni smiled and tilted her head to the side. "I haven't even told you what I want yet," she said. Her smile was quite endearing. At the same time, she was swaying from side to side like a high school student talking to a boy she liked, but she didn't realize it. "What difference does it make?" Luca said with amusement. "And the fee?" Eleni asked, taking another half step toward Luca. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Luca had known Eleni for a long time. He knew that the young woman could trap him in this matter, but still, her attraction was undeniable. "Dinner," he said, biting his lower lip. "Why not?" Eleni asked, biting her lower lip and shrugging one shoulder as if to imitate Luca's gesture. There were about 40 monitors connected to the security cameras. One of the security guards was looking at the date in Eleni's hand. Luca was listening to his radio and paying attention to Eleni, his arms crossed over his chest. "Now, did I understand correctly? One of the Americans is missing, and from here you will look at the security footage and find the taxi they took, and then from the taxi to the hotel they stayed at. So you will follow the men step by step," he said. "That's exactly what it's going to be," Eleni said, without taking her eyes off the screen. "Then why do you go to all this trouble?" "Duke is an old friend of mine. I was in Syria when I wrote my first international report. If it weren't for him, I would have been raped and killed by Syrian opposition," Eleni said, smiling. Luca swallowed hard and became serious. Eleni had won many international awards for her photographs in Syria, but she had never spoken about her experiences there. Learning about what had happened, even superficially, was chilling. Luca looked at the screen calmly and said, almost in a purring tone, "I thought they were good guys." "Things were a bit chaotic in Syria. It was a war where both sides were mean and brutal," Eleni said, without taking her eyes off the screen. "And if Duke Perry came all the way from New York for these two guys, then believe me, it's worth the trouble," the smiling woman added. Meanwhile, the operator displayed an image selected by the photo recognition program on the other screen. The program immediately recognized Tanner in white as the plane landed. The smiling journalist asked, "Did they get into a taxi?" When he followed the cameras one by one and saw them get into a taxi at the exit, he smiled with his pearly teeth and said, "Good, can I have the license plate of the car?" The weather was hot and stifling. The bad weather that had gripped Italy had not yet reached Greece. Eleni found a place to park her Honda and started walking towards the taxi rank. They had found it on the airport security camera that the taxi was connected to. Many taxis would linger at the exit gates after bringing their customers to the airport, trying to attract new customers. This taxi must have done the same. The place where Eleni had left her car was a very old neighborhood. Many of the two-story wooden houses with bay windows had colorful geraniums growing on their bay windows. She walked along the cobblestone road to the taxi rank, which was covered with ivy. The roof and walls of the small rank, made of old timber, were covered with ivy. The taxi drivers had gathered on the small veranda because of the hot weather. They were drinking tea they had made on a small barbecue and playing backgammon. Eleni approached the taxi rank smiling and said to one of the taxi drivers who was looking at her, "Hello, I'm looking for Mr. Georgerus." The old taxi driver raised his finger and smiled. "Miss Eleni?" he said with a wrinkled face. Eleni nodded and said, "Yes." The old man was in his 70s. His bushy mustache covered his lips. He wore small rectangular sunglasses. His face and hands were full of small lines and wrinkles, the most obvious traces of experience. The buttons of his short-sleeved shirt were unbuttoned, revealing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt. He had a thin, ready-made felt hat on his head. "Please sit down," the old man said, indicating the bench next to his chair. "Luca asked me to help you. What is this?" Eleni asked after she sat down. "This car picked up 2 American tourists from the airport. I need to know where it took them," Eleni said with a friendly, pleading expression on her face, holding out a notepad. The old man looked at the paper first from up close, then from a distance, and said, "Dimitri's car. It went to the customer, but it should arrive in half an hour. It's easy, he has a memory like poison." All you have to do is wait, he said, laughing. The young woman smiled and said, "No problem, I'll wait." With a sympathetic air, the mustached, plump, dark-skinned taxi driver sitting next to the old man smiled and pointed to the glass in his hand and asked, "Tea?" The woman nodded with satisfaction and said, "That would be great." Half an hour later, Dmitry Yanis arrived and he really had a sharp memory, just like the old man said. He had taken the tourists first to the Athens Palace Hotel, and from there to his cousin Barnabas Yanis' car rental service. Eleni gave the old man and Dmitry $50 each for their help and went to the car rental service. It was getting dark when she arrived at the car rental service. Eleni entered the two-story building's large glass floor, pleased that the air was starting to cool. At the entrance to the store, there were 2030 model cars lined up side by side. She waved her hand at the young man in a white shirt and denim pants who had stood up to greet her, and said, "Hello," with her usual smiling face. The young man had been sitting idle all day. Smiling with joy at finally finding a customer, he said, "Hello, come in." "Dmitry Yanis sent me," Eleni said, gesturing with her thumb as if he were behind her even though he wasn't actually there. "Ah, the reporter lady," the man said, pausing for a moment. It was obvious from his appearance that he was sorry to see that she had no customers. Still, Eleni smiled and said, "Yes." She had learned long ago that smiling was a factor that made everything easier in journalism and human relations. The man squinted, trying to remember the subject, and said, "You have questions about Americans?" Eleni nodded and asked, "Yes, did they rent a car?" The man smiled reflexively in response to the smile of the young woman in front of him and said, "Yes. They rented that Land Rover Defender. Few people rent those anyway. I've only been able to rent it to them for a month." Eleni's eyes lit up at the opportunity. "Really? What a shame. Does it have GPS?" she asked urgently. "Yes, there is," said the man, uneasy at this sudden change in the young woman. Eleni narrowed her eyes and shook her index finger at the man. "I'll tell you what. Give me the GPS records and I'll rent the car for the same price as the Americans, what do you say?" The smiling man immediately took out the GPS and keys of the Defender parked in front of his shop from his drawer. Duke woke up in the evening to a knock on his room door. Joanna had been waking up from nightmares many times all day. Both he and the young woman were still tired. When he opened the door with sleepy eyes, he found Eleni smiling and waving a Land Rover key. "We'll drink raka at the fish restaurant tonight, Duke Perry, and tomorrow we'll follow the adventures of the mysterious tracks," she said. July 31st, Novi Sad, Serbia. For duty. The young woman stopped and watched an old model Mercedes Unimog pass her. There were 6 militiamen in green military camouflage sitting back to back in the back of the small, all-terrain vehicle. It had been 5 years since the young woman, Irina Felshanova, had come to Serbia from Ukraine. The blonde, athletic young woman had braided her golden hair this morning. Everything had gone wrong in this country she had come to by marriage. But she was better off than she was in Ukraine. She worked for a tourism company during the day and in a bar at night, taking care of her 3-year-old son. The beautiful woman with blue eyes and full lips, who had been tried to be a sex slave many times, had somehow escaped each time. She looked around nervously at the beginning of the alley she had come to after receiving a mobile phone message in the morning. She was wearing the uniform the tourism company had given her. She was wearing navy blue trousers and jacket, a white shirt, black high heels and a purple striped scarf. She couldn't help but shiver when she saw the bearded man coming towards her from the end of the alley. A mercenary named Michael Richardson was guarding Andrei Yavor, Polanov's right-hand man who controlled the city. "Hello, Irina," said Michael Richardson, speaking slowly and confidently. From where he stood he could clearly see the town square. Irina was hunched over, her arms folded across her chest as if she were cold. "Hello," she said in a timid voice. Michael said with an expression close to a smile, "I need your help today. The kind of help you will definitely get in return," and tore the $200 bills he had left at eye level in half before Irina could take them, and gave the half-coins in his left hand to the woman who was looking at him angrily. "I have a customer at that cafe. My boss wants to give him this USB drive. I don't want to be seen with that guy either." "Is that all for this?" "I'll give a guy a USB drive and get $200, Irina said suspiciously, her eyes narrowing. Michael smiled this time and said, "No, you sit where you can reach the guy and slip this into his pocket without being seen. I'll give you $200 for that." "What's on the disc?" the woman asked, looking at the small burgundy USB data carrier in her hand. "I don't know and I don't care, Irina. Because there are probably things in there that Polanov will kill you, me, and our families for if he finds out what's in them," Michael said, as casually as if he were talking about something ordinary. Irina swallowed and took the USB. Polanov's name was not spoken for nothing. Even if Michael didn't pay, he had to do the job now. Arthur Mitchell had arrived in the city just 12 hours before SEAL 6. His mission was reconnaissance and intelligence, but when SEAL 6 was unexpectedly destroyed, he had been ordered to stay in the city. The young man had been on similar missions before. But Novi Sad had been the place he had struggled the most. In small towns and cities, everyone knew each other, and strangers were easily noticed. This was especially frustrating when Polanov and his men were in control of this small city. Arthur was sitting at the Café Belle Femme, which overlooked almost the only square in Novi Sad, as instructed. Most of the café was made up of small tables set out on the wide, stone pavement. Arthur, who was supposed to meet his contact who would give him important information at the café that bore the French name, stayed until noon as he had been ordered, and after a snack in the afternoon, he left the café. When he had gone only 30 meters from the café, the small Samsung cell phone he had been given began to ring. When Arthur answered the phone, seeing that it was a local number, the person on the other end said, "You must deliver the package immediately." Arthur frowned. "I didn't get any packages, why the?" he said, noticing the USB in his right pocket. "Damn," he grumbled, as he saw the patrol coming from across him. The man on the phone said calmly, "They will notice the package is missing very soon. Send the package and get out of town immediately." Arthur simply said, "Uncle," and hung up, making a show of using his cell phone as he passed the patrol. His hotel was only a few blocks from the square. When he had passed the first block, his cell phone started ringing again. The caller ID was Uncle Ricky. Arthur answered the phone, hissing curses through his teeth. "Uncle, how are you?" he asked cheerfully as a Serbian family passed by. The voice on the other end was barely audible. His crackling, staticky voice said from deep within, "Arthur, we haven't seen each other in almost a week. Your family has been very worried about you. Is everything okay?" he asked. Arthur tried to smile and pulled over to the side of the road to cross the street as he had been taught, checking both sides of the road. Behind him, about 20 meters away, he saw two men in sports jackets and sunglasses, and 10 meters behind them, three men in a BMW. "Yeah, Uncle's on his way. I'll call them as soon as I get a chance," Arthur said, turning off his phone, removing the battery, and throwing it in the trash can. The number was his code for being compromised. The word curiosity was his command to escape. Arthur, who was running as he was shouted at, heard the familiar hammering sounds of small caliber weapons. When two bullets tore through the air, he swore and pulled his P228 from the back of his jacket. He quickly reached out from behind the Volkswagen Polo and shot at two men trying to cross to his side of the street. The first man collapsed to the ground with blood spraying from his chest, pink because of the dust and droplets. The other man threw himself behind the cars while several civilians on the street screamed and ran for cover. Arthur jumped after Polo and dove into the alleyway at the sound of brakes coming from the other side of the street. A few seconds later, the alleyway wall was shattered by bullets. Arthur sprinted to the end of the alleyway, skidded and threw himself onto the right side. The windows of the tailor's shop across the alley were shattered by the gunshots that followed one another down the alleyway and echoed off the walls of the buildings. The young man, who suddenly collided with two militiamen coming out of the corner, crashed into the wall behind the men with two other men. Both men were carrying AK-47s. Arthur quickly grabbed the gun of the man on his left by the stock with his left hand, put his gun under the man's chin with his right hand and pulled the trigger. The dirty white floor behind him was painted burgundy with blood and brain particles spurting upwards in an instant. The man went into hydrostatic shock as he died from the impact of being shot, his entire body convulsed. The man who pulled the trigger of his gun tore his friend to pieces without even realizing it. While the two men were falling to the ground, the men who came out of the alley Arthur had just left started shooting. Arthur grabbed the second man who was shot by the collar and pulled him into the alley. He took a hand grenade from the man's assault vest, pulled the pin, threw it under the Renault Clio that was seen diagonally and started running towards the other end of the alley. The sound waves from the explosion of the grenade hit him like a slap on the back, many windows broke and the car alarm started to go off. But Arthur had gotten what he wanted, buying a few crucial seconds to stop the militia behind him. He was in a deadly chase in the back streets of Novi Sad. The man, who was 180 tall, weighed 95 kilos. The blond, blue-eyed man had a week-long beard on his face. He was wearing a denim jacket and pants, a t-shirt and running shoes. The gun in his hand was a 9mm model produced for the military and held 13 bullets. Arthur had chosen this weapon, which was smaller than the others, because it was easy to carry and hide. Before joining the Navy, he lived in New York and was interested in the sport of parkour. Parkour athletes called themselves trailblazers. Their exact goal was to overcome all obstacles using only their own physical strength and abilities to reach any point. Thanks to the internet and movies, this sport had spread rapidly and the movements used had turned into artistic figures that required more artistry, courage and acrobatic talent. People did not have to rediscover the movements they saw on the internet, they repeated what they learned a few times and then added something to it, taking the movement and the sport further. Parkour became a lifestyle after a while. Arthur had not pushed himself this hard for a long time. He could hear the footsteps of the men behind him. Arthur slid to a halt on his knees next to the garbage. The backpack he had hidden behind the trash can was still there. He took out his spare magazines, tablet computer and satellite phone from the bag. Pulling the pin from the incendiary grenade at the bottom and putting it under the bag, the young man turned on the computer and dialed the number he had memorized from the satellite phone and inserted the USB data carrier into it. He probably wouldn't have time to destroy the phone and computer. He caught a movement out of the corner of his eye while the data was being transferred. He turned back to the alleyway with his gun, but a hard blow to his shoulder knocked him to the ground. He couldn't get himself together. The AK-47 bullet that had shot him had entered his right shoulder and exited his left arm, destroying everything in between. Everything on the USB carrier had already reached naval intelligence before he was dead in a few seconds. Michael Richardson was following him down the street with clenched teeth and fists. A few seconds after the soldiers reached the end of the alley, there was a muffled explosion and flames rose from the back of the alley. Over the screams of the burning soldiers, Richardson said through his teeth in a voice that even he could barely hear, "Good boy." August 1st, Greece, Athens. Duke Perry nearly jumped when the phone rang. When he answered it, he heard Firstman, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, say, "Duke, it's me. Call me at noon at the cheese shop," and then he hung up. Duke tried to wake up. It had been years since Firstman had called him like that. Duke hung up with a serious expression and sat up. "What happened?" Joanna asked in a sleepy murmur. Duke sat down on the bedside, pushing back his hair. Firstman called. "I need to call him from the cheesemonger," he said. "Cheese man?" Joanna asked, half rising from the bed. "He's an old friend of ours. When we first met, he was importing cheese from France, now he's in the wine business. We always go to his shop when we think the phone's being tapped," Duke said, getting out of bed. "Why can't we listen in?" Joanna asked, sitting up in bed, still groggy. The Duke laughed, straightened up, put on his trousers, and left the room, saying, "They can if they find out where it is, but they haven't found it yet. And besides, their wine is wonderful." Firstman had said noon. That meant in 15 minutes. Lounging around the clothing store on the block behind the New York Times, Firstman checked his watch and clicked on his burner phone. 2 minutes later, An international call came in. He looked around and answered. Relieved, he recognized Duke's voice. Hello, Firstman, what's going on? Duke's voice echoed from afar. Firstman continued to check his surroundings. Listen, Adam Coleman was murdered. What, how? Asked the Duke, after a moment's pause. A drug addict attacked him in his garage, Firstman said, his expression sad and strained. Duke's staticky voice crackled with anger. Do you believe this nonsense? If I believed it, I wouldn't be calling you, Firstman said. Arthur grabbed the second man who was shot by the collar and pulled him into the alley. He took a hand grenade from the man's assault vest, pulled the pin, threw it under the Renault Clio that was seen diagonally and started running towards the other end of the alley. The sound waves from the explosion of the grenade hit him like a slap on the back, many windows broke and the car alarm started to go off. But Arthur had gotten what he wanted, buying a few crucial seconds to stop the militia behind him. He was in a deadly chase in the back streets of Novi Sad. The man, who was 180 tall, weighed 95 kilos. The blond, blue-eyed man had a week-long beard on his face. He was wearing a denim jacket and pants, a t-shirt and running shoes. The gun in his hand was a 9mm model produced for the military and held 13 bullets. Arthur had chosen this weapon, which was smaller than the others, because it was easy to carry and hide. Before joining the Navy, he lived in New York and was interested in the sport of parkour. Parkour athletes called themselves trailblazers. Their exact goal was to overcome all obstacles using only their own physical strength and abilities to reach any point. Thanks to the internet and movies, this sport had spread rapidly and the movements used had turned into artistic figures that required more artistry, courage and acrobatic talent. People did not have to rediscover the movements they saw on the internet, they repeated what they learned a few times and then added something to it, taking the movement and the sport further. Parkour became a lifestyle after a while. Arthur had not pushed himself this hard for a long time. He could hear the footsteps of the men behind him. Arthur slid to a halt on his knees next to the garbage. The backpack he had hidden behind the trash can was still there. He took out his spare magazines, tablet computer and satellite phone from the bag. Pulling the pin from the incendiary grenade at the bottom and putting it under the bag, the young man turned on the computer and dialed the number he had memorized from the satellite phone and inserted the USB data carrier into it. He probably wouldn't have time to destroy the phone and computer. He caught a movement out of the corner of his eye while the data was being transferred. He turned back to the alleyway with his gun, but a hard blow to his shoulder knocked him to the ground. He couldn't get himself together. The AK-47 bullet that had shot him had entered his right shoulder and exited his left arm, destroying everything in between. Everything on the USB carrier had already reached naval intelligence before he was dead in a few seconds. Michael Richardson was following him down the street with clenched teeth and fists. A few seconds after the soldiers reached the end of the alley, there was a muffled explosion and flames rose from the back of the alley. Over the screams of the burning soldiers, Richardson said through his teeth in a voice that even he could barely hear, "Good boy." August 1st, Greece, Athens. Duke Perry nearly jumped when the phone rang. When he answered it, he heard Firstman, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, say, "Duke, it's me. Call me at noon at the cheese shop," and then he hung up. Duke tried to wake up. It had been years since Firstman had called him like that. Duke hung up with a serious expression and sat up. "What happened?" Joanna asked in a sleepy murmur. Duke sat down on the bedside, pushing back his hair. Firstman called. "I need to call him from the cheesemonger," he said. "Cheese man?" Joanna asked, half rising from the bed. "He's an old friend of ours. When we first met, he was importing cheese from France, now he's in the wine business. We always go to his shop when we think the phone's being tapped," Duke said, getting out of bed. "Why can't we listen in?" Joanna asked, sitting up in bed, still groggy. The Duke laughed, straightened up, put on his trousers, and left the room, saying, "They can if they find out where it is, but they haven't found it yet. And besides, their wine is wonderful." Firstman had said noon. That meant in 15 minutes. Lounging around the clothing store on the block behind the New York Times, Firstman checked his watch and clicked on his burner phone. 2 minutes later, an international call came in. He looked around and answered. Relieved, he recognized Duke's voice. "Hello, Firstman, what's going on?" Duke's voice echoed from afar. Firstman continued to check his surroundings. "Listen, Adam Coleman was murdered." "What, how?" asked the Duke, after a moment's pause. "A drug addict attacked him in his garage," Firstman said, his expression sad and strained. Duke's staticky voice crackled with anger. "Do you believe this nonsense?" "If I believed it, I wouldn't be calling you," Firstman said. Then he asked, "Was the job Coleman was after related to you?" "Could be. A few things needed to be investigated. Someone tried to kill us in Italy," Duke said. This conversation was relatively safe, but business was growing and he didn't want to put Firstman in danger. Forsman looked at the length of the conversation and said, "Anyway, Coleman's stuff is missing. Be careful, Duke. The ice we're walking on is starting to thin." Duke said reassuringly, "Don't worry, I plan to retire too. Dying would spoil my plans," and he hung up the pay phone in the hotel lobby. He looked at his watch. It was still far from dawn, and complete darkness awaited him. August 1st, Queens, New York. It was a hot New York day, the humid air making it even harder to breathe. The entire building, which had been purchased last month, had signs at the entrance stating that it belonged to WorkNex. The building would be a complete business center. That's why the construction workers who entered hadn't attracted any attention. Polanov and his team, who had settled into the building, had begun to make preparations and plans for the operation. Polanov looked from the rooftop at the street view in front of him and took his cigarette out of his pants. As he was looking for his lighter, a lighter appeared in front of him and lit up. Fernandez, who came into view as Polanov leaned over and lit his cigarette, asked with a smile, "What do you think?" Polanov said in a flirtatious tone, smiling and taking a deep drag on his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. "There's only a little bit left," Fernandez said, taking the cigarette from Polanov's hand and taking a deep drag just like Polanov. "Yes," Polanov said, taking out a new cigarette and nodding his head. "Indeed, it is." "Is that bitch Nadia necessary?" Fernandez asked in annoyance, looking around. "They stipulated in the agreement that when they gave us the virus, Nadia would act as a kind of inspector," Polanov said. Fernandez leaned forward, resting his elbows on the roof railings. This movement revealed the smooth curves of his shapely hips. As Polanov watched her with amusement, Fernandez asked, "Do you trust that woman?" "No," Polanov said, moving behind Fernandez. "But you're here, and you'll protect me," he said, pressing his groin against her hips. Fernandez straightened up, smiling, as Polanov grabbed her hair roughly, bent her forward again, and pulled down his pants. Fernandez groaned and thrust his hips into Polanov, smiling as they both did so. Polanov was watching outside through the dusty windows while Fernandez had the men organize the newly arrived equipment and supplies. He heard the sound of his cell phone. He had received a message. Frowning, Polanov picked up the backpack he had left by the wall and approached Fernandez. "Get your stuff and follow me," he said. As the two left the building and entered the subway station 1 block away, 4 black Dodge SUVs with state plates, 2 meters apart, were moving fast. About 200 meters above them was a black helicopter with the FBI written on its side. August 1st, Samsun, Turkey. Brain Turner. The man, who was 5 feet tall, brushed back his brown hair that reached his ears and put on his cap. He was wearing the navy blue overalls used by telephone company technical service personnel. His hazel eyes were squinting in the sun. He was a handsome man with an angular face and a dimpled chin. The security guard in front of him was guiding him through the large airport garden. He was wearing one of those photo badges they use when entering high-security areas like airports. Although the name on his badge and ID was Ahmed Hakir, the man's real name was Brain Turner. He had been working for the CIA in Turkey for almost 10 years. "I haven't seen you here before," the calm security guard said. He had a freshly lit cigarette in his right hand. "I've never been to the airport before." "I'm new to the city," the man said in fluent, unaccented Turkish, watching the security guard closely. The security guard looked over his shoulder and smiled, asking, "Did you like Samsun?" "It's a quiet place," Turner said, shrugging. The security guard nodded, smiled, and asked, "Where were you before?" "Istanbul," Turner said, smiling. "Oh, big city," the man said complimentarily. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Turner shrugged again and said, "Quiet, cheap and comfortable." Samsun was a city in northern Turkey, almost in the middle of the Black Sea region. It was also the most populous and developed part of the region. The security guard shook his finger and said, "Look, you're right about that." At this point, he came to the large box where the telephone lines passed. He looked around and asked, "Do you want me to wait here?" When Turner said, "It might take a while," "Okay, I'll be at the entrance, let me know when you're done," the security guard said. The man nodded in understanding and opened the box with the phone lines and started working. In fact, the airport's phone lines were solid. Only the security cameras, because they were closed circuit, couldn't be accessed or controlled from the CIA headquarters. So in order to get into the system, they had to disrupt the phone infrastructure and wait for a service technician to call. The service technician waited until the security guard had moved away, and then he connected a satellite phone he had taken from the repair kit and another device that looked like a pager with a data cable. He put a Bluetooth headset on his left ear. "Okay, we're connected," the voice in his earpiece said in English. "Good," Turner replied. "How long?" 2 minutes, the voice in the headset said calmly. For 2 minutes the tall man waited for his operators to breach the firewalls, pretending to juggle the wires. Finally, when the message "We're inside" came through the headset, he gathered his supplies and left. "Yeah, which way?" The big man in the Ford Transit sporting phone company logos tapped his earpiece and asked. The CIA operator, who could now access the camera footage, had determined when and in which vehicles the scientists who arrived at the airport left. The next part began to follow the traffic and security cameras of the police department they had connected to in the morning. The operator said in a calm voice, "They have proceeded to the Ankara Road, sir." Turner turned his car onto the Ankara Road. "You don't have to call me sir," the man said with a smile. Knox had said the operators were very young. Brain Turner started his Ford Transit and started tracking. August 1st, Nea Stria, north of Athens, Greece. They set off at dawn, heading northwest to catch the first ferry that morning. They were following the old GPS records of their Land Rover Defender. Less than an hour later, they arrived at the port of Nea Stria. The sea they were crossing was the border between the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. The port they landed at was small, built for a single ferry. There were 3 or 4-story apartment buildings just ahead of the open space with asphalt on a short concrete floor. Duke couldn't help but sigh, thinking that the people living here were very lucky, and the reporter saw a beach on their right. Eleni smiled and said, "If you want, we can buy swimsuits and bikinis from the markets up ahead." "Maybe," Duke said with a smile, unable to help but think about what Joanna might look like in a bikini. It had taken them almost 2 hours to reach the small town of Flevovirisi. He raised his hand in greeting as Defender passed by several villages. The 2-story houses in the small town were mostly painted white. After leaving the town, which was mostly covered with olive trees, they stopped for lunch in another small village about an hour and a half later. Almost the only sound in the quiet, summer-heated town was the old tunes coming from the small transistor radio. The small group set off again an hour later, engaged in entertaining conversation among themselves as they made their way through the winding terrain of the Aegean Mountains. The roads were paved and deserted. They had not seen anyone for the last hour. Still, Duke could not help but check behind him in his rearview mirror every now and then. Even Joanna had shaken off the dead soil. Finally, they had arrived at the GPS's destination. It was a small bay facing the north side of the peninsula they had arrived on. A small freshwater spring connected to the Aegean through a small bay. On the other side of the stream, a small abandoned village was visible. This village was the last stop on the GPS. Crossing the stream on an old bridge, 3 journalists saw that the village was surrounded by high pole barbed wire. In some places, there were private property signs the size of a piece of paper on the wire. But most of them were so rusted that they were barely legible. The iron gate at the entrance was closed and locked with chains. Duke first tested the chains, then as he pulled the wires, a movement on his left caught his attention. Eleni and Joanna were waving at him, laughing. The woman, who was grinning and waving like a naughty child, pointed to a huge hole on the side and asked, "Come on, why are you hanging around there?" While Joanna giggled and walked through the wires. There wasn't much information on the internet about the deserted village, which was half lit by the red light of the evening sun. It was under pine trees, so it wasn't visible to satellite photos or mapping services like Google Earth. Eleni could find out on her smartphone that the village had been abandoned in the 1970s and had been bought by a large foreign company in the 1990s. The buildings, which usually had no windows, were mostly crumbling, and a few had roofs that had collapsed from neglect. Duke saw a sign on the wall of one of them, written in a color that had now turned from burgundy to brown. He turned his camera lens to the sign and pressed the shutter. Joanna came up to him and said, "Tenebris pug. Nemesis. K and Luchem," spelling it out. "What does this mean?" Duke narrowed his eyes and said, "We will fight in the dark until dawn," and then he saw the tree trunks parallel to the ground in the shade of the trees. When Duke saw the track made of tree trunks, he cursed with a sour face, while Eleni said, "They tried to do something here." The experienced journalist had visited enough militant camps to recognize military camps and training tracks when she saw them. Inside the wooded area was a pile of earth, 2 meters high on each side and just as wide, and 10 meters high in front, forming a giant U-shape, 20 meters deep. "It's a shooting range," Duke said, looking over his shoulder, disgruntled. "A shooting range?" Joanna asked curiously, looking at the mound of dirt. She had only ever seen shooting indoors. "Yeah," Duke said as he walked toward the range. Eleni looked at the area and asked, "Was there target practice?" "There's more," Duke said, looking at a house whose walls were completely covered in soot. He sifted through pine needles on the ground at the mouth of the range. He frowned as he found a copper casing. He took pictures of the ground, seeing that it was almost covered in casings. "Terrorist camp?" Eleni asked, getting down on one knee. "I guess," Duke said, looking around. "The PKK was mostly trained in Greece when they were fighting against Turkey," Eleni said, looking around with furrowed brows. Duke looked around, straightened up, threw down the bucket in his hand, and growled, "I don't think this place belongs to them." The PKK was a terrorist organization that claimed to defend Kurdish freedom, but the man who founded it was someone trained by Turkish intelligence. He was then caught in a flashy operation, and then the organization only started carrying out demonstration attacks when the government's internal politics were tight. Its main source of income was drugs and extortion from the regions it controlled. It was almost dark, and they had turned on the headlights of the vehicle to continue on the asphalt road. The heat that had tested their patience and endurance all day had given way to the cool breeze of the Aegean and the smell of pine. Just after they passed the village where they had worked at noon, Perry's phone started ringing. When Perry saw the name on the phone, he grumbled with curiosity. His friend from the FBI, Peter Andrew, was calling directly from his office line. He turned to Eleni and said, "Can you move your hand to the right? I need to answer the phone," and then he answered the phone. "Hi, Perry," said the familiar voice above the crackles and static of the international connection. "Hello, Andrew," Duke said, narrowing his eyes and plugging one ear with his index finger. His full attention was on the other end of the voice. He had noticed that something was out of the ordinary. Now he was unconsciously looking for evidence of it. "I found your men, but this time things will be different," Peter said. His voice was indeed tense, as Duke had first thought. At this point Eleni had pulled over to the right. "Like what?" Duke said as he got out of the car and started walking. We'll share some information, Peter said with a sigh. The middle-aged man's voice sounded quite tired. Why not? Duke said, trying to understand how serious the situation was. By this time, he had discovered what was really bothering him. The gap between the conversations showed that the speaker on the other end of the phone was on. Peter Andrew was having this conversation in front of someone else. First of all, I'm curious as to why you left the country, Peter said calmly, pausing. Duke had gotten far enough away from the car. Slowing his pace, he said, I was doing some research on the photo I sent you. He didn't know what was going on, but it seemed strange and dangerous. He was especially nervous after his phone call with Firstman. Do you know where the photo was taken? Peter asked. Yes, Perry said with a half-smile. He saw the advantage that appeared before him and decided to take advantage of it. But that requires a separate agreement, he said in a sincere and sympathetic tone. Peter's voice on the other end was curious. Like what? He asked. If I tell you where it was taken, you can give me the history of the name I gave you, Duke said, reaching into his pocket and looking around at the landscape. With Homeland Security. Peter began immediately, reactively. But Duke quickly interrupted him, saying, he's not an American citizen, I met him on my trip. This was clearly a sign that he had the situation under control. In response, FBI agent Peter Andrew remained silent for a moment, while Perry waited patiently and waved at the two beautiful women who were following him in the Land Rover. Okay, it's settled, said Peter's voice. Good, you are looking for a lady named Isabella Feluoxi, the Duke said with a smile of amusement. Who is that? Peter asked, having never heard that name before. She's an associate professor at the University of Rome. She specializes in the First Crusade. The photo was taken from her house with a long-range camera near the Vatican helipad. It's been years, of course, but Isabella must still be doing the same thing, Duke said, drawing conclusions from what he observed during his time there. So where did you find that photo? Peter asked curiously. It's in the drafts section at the email address of the recently deceased George Starin, Duke said, smoothing back his hair with his hand. Peter paused and said, no email sent? No, said Duke calmly. When Peter paused again, Duke assuming he was fielding questions from another person or persons in the room, Peter said quickly, are there any other emails in there? Of course there is, I'll send it to you, said Duke, maintaining his friendly demeanor. So what are you doing in that godforsaken place? Duke looked up, grinning. He was genuinely curious about whether they were tracking him by satellite or a drone right now, and what he looked like. I went to an abandoned camp in the woods at the end of the road. Could Tanner and White be working for the CIA? He asked with journalistic urgency. No, said Andrew, after waiting a while. They weren't working. Is there anyone from the CIA there? Duke asked, grinning. Peter's voice was like that of a child who had been caught trying to fool his friend for fun. Of course not, he said pointedly. Duke knew the man was saying that for the audio recordings. Peter asked, so Tanner and White entered Greece together, according to the records here. Tanner returned, contacted you, and was killed. White is nowhere to be found. What did Tanner tell you? Duke shrugged, unconsciously. Tanner didn't live to tell me anything. We were supposed to meet him a short distance from where he was killed. On our way there, we saw that Tanner had been killed. At first, we thought it was a traffic accident, but when the car that hit him was burned in the harbor, I became suspicious and called Detective Paul from the NYPD. We went to Tanner's house with him. Tanner's fiancée had been killed in the house, and Tanner's camera and laptop were missing. That's when I got to it, he said, explaining the situation bluntly. Then he stopped and asked, my turn, who was the white-suited man, the Vatican guard, and the punk? The agent paused, the other end of the phone quietly discussing how much information Duke should be given. Things had escalated quickly, and he had unwittingly put Peter in a difficult position. How do you know it's a guard? Peter asked. Answer first, Peter. The agent paused. Duke thought he heard a few papers being passed. Then Peter's voice said calmly, the man's name was Antonio Manelli, commander of Pope Octavius's guard. He was killed in the assassination. Man in white? Duke scratched the beard that was growing on his chin and realized that things were getting very complicated. Usually things weren't this complicated. Scandals were well hidden, but they weren't complicated. Otto von Lonsenrader, the FBI agent said. From Peter's tone, Duke figured he must have recognized the man. He was missing something. Who is that? He asked. I have no idea. We don't have access to his file, Peter said haltingly. When I came to Rome I saw the coat of arms on your coat and a history book. The Duke asked in annoyance, trying to memorize the complicated German name. Punk? And that's Polanov, said Peter. Polanov? The Duke repeated curiously. The head of the assassination group, Peter said gloomily. Duke's eyes widened in horror. He already knew the fourth person. His boss. Simultaneously. Langley, Virginia, USA. FBI agent Andrew Peter, who had been talking to Duke on the other end of the phone, looked sullenly at Knox and Ferguson. In his attempt to help Duke, he had found himself in deep trouble and had been summoned directly to CIA headquarters. Fortunately, his mutual working relationship with Duke had never been a secret and had actually paid tangible dividends to the FBI on several occasions. That reporter, Duke Perry. Can we trust him? Knox asked the 6'3" man in his 40s who stood before him, rolling up his sleeves and rubbing his aching neck. The man in the suit, with short black hair, a wide forehead, thick eyebrows, and hazel eyes, asked with a smile, did you trust anyone in this job? But if you ask me if Duke Perry, even though he is a reckless reporter, would stand up to both his own boss and one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, I'm afraid the answer is no, he said. Knox nodded with a half-smile. Then, looking at the photograph, he asked, why are Polanov, Edward McCrollins, Antonio Manelli, and that Otto von Lonsenrader in the same photo? The question was not directed at the FBI agent, it was merely a generalized thought. Ferguson turned the photo over and asked, when was the photo taken? The FBI agent said, the photo is numbered 20,300,713,009, which means it was taken a few months before the assassination. Knox leaned toward the photograph and asked, what's Polanov giving me? What's that thing in his hand? That thing is a bronze plate, one of 15,000 artifacts looted from the National Museum of Iraq by American soldiers, the FBI agent said. Are you serious? Ferguson asked, eyebrows raised and hissing in a high-pitched whistle. He knew that American soldiers had looted the Baghdad National Museum, but he had no idea how serious the situation was. Yes, the FBI agent said, his lips curling. Knox didn't want to focus on that right now. So why would Edward M.C. Rollins buy something like that from Polanov? And in the Vatican garden, anyway. The FBI agent sighed and said, I don't know. The bronze disc could be a map or directions. A Norwegian professor did some research on it in 1999. We can't connect with him? Ferguson asked curiously. He died in a fire along with his investigation. There were just a few general articles in a few newspapers about his investigation, the FBI agent said, shaking his head. This is a goddamned puzzle, Knox grumbled with a sigh. He'll pick up the missing pieces. They'd gotten a tip that Polanov had been spotted in Queens and had him taken by mere minutes. The raid had left 5 FBI strike team agents dead, 1 maimed, and 3 wounded. All they got in return was 20 dead thugs and the body of Professor Kermensky. Knox had bitten the telephone receiver in anger. Polanov was always one step ahead. Let's hope we have time to put the pieces together, Ferguson grumbled, getting up from the table and heading for the coffee machine. At the same time, Athens, Greece. As they were walking back to their hotel room, Eleni looked in the rearview mirror and said, someone's following us. Duke turned the defender's right mirror to check behind him, while Eleni added, "White Renault Megan," and turned right onto the road leading to the hotel. When Megan turned right as well, she asked, "What should we do?" Perry shrugged. "Let's go to the hotel. We don't know who they are. I'm too old for pointless chases. This car isn't right, and we're not in a James Bond movie anyway." Joanna and Eleni both laughed nervously. When they arrived at the hotel, their pursuers were nowhere to be seen. But Duke was sure they were out there somewhere. Perry called his cousin as he got out of the car. "Hey, cousin," Duke said, smiling as a familiar voice came out on the crackling line. "I'll give you a few names. I'd appreciate it if you could track these guys' accounts and credit card activity. I need to know where they are now, and if they move, you need to let me know." "You've turned this into a total spy movie," Thomas said, laughing on the other end of the phone. "Isn't life more fun this way?" Duke said, laughing. End of chapter 3.